National Fuel is proud to support Stories of Service. National Fuel is a diversified energy company committed to the safe and environmentally conscientious development, transportation, and distribution of natural gas, and to the principles of safety, environmental stewardship, community, innovation, satisfaction, and transparency.
I was in the classroom, and the guy that taught next to me came over and said, "You got to turn your TV on." I had a class full of kids, so I turned the TV on. And it was about 30 seconds before the second plane hit the South Tower. And I remember seeing the first plane and having been to New York City and knowing how big that the World Trade Centers were. And the silhouette of the strike, I knew that that wasn't a small plane. But watching the second one go in, I turned to him and he was still standing at the door. I said, "We're at war." And that was the first thing that hit me was, this isn't an accident. Somebody's attacking us. We're at war. And by the end of the morning, obviously, the Pentagon had been hit. The World Trade Centers had collapsed. The plane in Shanksville, United 93, had also gone down. But we didn't know what else was going to happen. Was this the beginning of a prolonged attack, or was this the culmination? So at that point, nobody really knew that the attack itself lasted about an hour. But after that, certainly within the traffic and the buzz within the military community, something was afoot and something was going to happen. And by the end of the day, the president had made a statement from the White House that was pretty telling, that the United States was going to be moving militarily somewhere. And for about the next year or so, there were preparations that were occurring. And I felt that it was most likely that I would be deployed, go off to whatever part of the world that we were going to be fighting in, and it appeared to be Afghanistan at the time. So I kind of had that sense from 9/11 on that, definitely something's going to occur, and I'm going to be deployed. So we got prepared and ready for that. We had already had National Guard missions that were in control of Bosnia. We knew that the Kosovo mission was out there, where it would be a National Guard unit that would be in charge and responsible for basically the peace enforcement throughout Kosovo. And at some point we got a warning order for my particular slice of a unit. It was really basically officers out of the 1st and 112th that were going to be called on to go to Kosovo as part of this mission. So that became known probably in the fall of 2002. So by 2003, the warning order came out before Christmas. So we knew we were going to Kosovo, and we were going to be part of a contingent that would be responsible for providing a safe and secure environment within Kosovo. So I learned what I could about Kosovo and what was going on there. Obviously, we'd had an active duty presence for a number of years, given the genocide and the turmoil that had been occurring in the region from Bosnia down into Kosovo itself. So I knew that that was where we were going to go. And it was the first time that a National Guard command would assume command of basically a theater of operation, Multinational Brigade East. So it was the first time that we were doing that. I want to say up until maybe a year before we were deployed there, it was still considered a combat zone. So they were getting combat patches. It was, when we were there, it was a hostile fire zone. It was, I don't want to say get the perks, but you didn't have to pay income tax because of the hazardous duty area that it was. I think one of the first things that I read about Kosovo that really got my attention was there were over 1 million landmines on the ground in Kosovo. And Kosovo is not a big place. So when you come to understand kind of the mentality of what was going on there, it was eye-opening for certain.
My name is Greg Henning. I teach Western civilization at Northeast High School, but I never thought, being in the military, that I'd visit the cradle of civilization, Baghdad, Iraq. Well, I enlisted about 6 months out of high school. I was working at GE and seeing all these World War II vets that were breaking me in Building 13. And I decided maybe there's a little bit more out there than working at GE the rest of my life. So I went down the recruiting station, and before I know it, was on a bus Greyhound bus out of Erie up to Buffalo, and before I knew it, I was down at Fort Dix, New Jersey, going through my basic training. I spent 4 years at Fort Devens, Massachusetts, and I became an electronics instructor. So I came back to Erie after that little stint, and I was working back at GE again, but a little more better skill set. And then I joined the Army Reserve, and eventually I made it in the Pennsylvania National Guard, and I went off to OCS. So I spent 19, almost 20 years in the Pennsylvania National Guard, and then I transitioned into what they call the Individual Ready Reserve, because I was teaching full-time, teaching half-time, and still working at GE, so something had to fall off the table. And then my first week of teaching at Northeast High School was 9/11. So I can still remember the principal announcing one plane hit the tower, then 2 planes hit the tower, then the whole world kind of stopped for a few minutes, and then kind of played out from there. And then in 2004, again, my wife gets a telegram at home, and she calls me on the cell phone, "Hey, you're being deployed." So that kind of, your whole world kind of spins around, and your focus is getting things ready. I mean, you have to get a will done, you have to make sure all your matters are taken care of before you go down range. And Benning was kind of a neat experience. I mean, I'm an infantry officer, so it's kind of like going back home a little bit. My youngest daughter was born there. But it was very chaotic there. I mean, you see massive amount of people. Some want to be there, and some people don't want to be there at all. And there were so many people at Benning, they couldn't put people up in the fort anymore. They had to go out to hotel rooms. And so we were going in and out every day. And towards the end of November, we got orders to go to Fort Bliss. And from Fort Bliss, we put on a very large aircraft, and we were off to Kuwait. So that was like landing in a whole different world. I mean, you are not in Kansas anymore when you go into the Middle East. It's just a different experience. During my first deployment, I was working at the embassy in Baghdad, and I had a Washington, D.C. phone number. So I could call her on my phone, and we could have a conversation, and I would update her what's going on. The only time it was really kind of distressing to her was ever so often we get mortar and rocket rounds going into the compound, and she could overhear like the big voice, take cover, rounds impacting. So, love you, gotta go. I was what we call a congressional trip planner. So all congressmen coming into Iraq would go through my office. I would plan everything from basically when wheels down in Baghdad International Airport until they actually left the country. One of my very first Cordels was John McCain and Hillary Clinton. I think Lindsey Graham was in that, Russ Feingold was in there, and Susan Collins. So you had 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats. The majority of them were on the Senate's Appropriation Committee, which is very important for what we're doing. Hillary Clinton came in with John McCain because John McCain and her kind of formed a special relationship. It was kind of cool to see that. They visited with Iraqi officials first day. Second day we went up to Fallujah, which is an interesting experience given what happened just a year before with a major military operation before the election. And then after that, right there, we went up to a place called Kirkuk, where they met with some of the local Iraqi leaders, and then they left, and I got to stay overnight in Kirkuk, which was an interesting experience. The next day, we flew back by helicopter. Well, we call ourselves O5s, which is a military rank, as a lieutenant colonel, over 50. And during my second deployment, there was quite a few of us that were in that particular situation, so a little more mature, and we were kind of mobilized as individuals, okay? We didn't mobilize with a group, and we kind of formed our little battle buddy group. And it's kind of neat, we have a picture right now of our O5s, O50 with the current Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin.
My name is Jay Brenneman, and my American dream is a country where everybody has a chance to live a happy and productive life without the fear of hunger, without the fear of knowing if they were going to be forced out of their home, that they can live in a safe community, and that they can live a life that is free from abuse, discrimination, and want. I was 18 years old, working at a food warehouse. It was my first real full-time job. And I woke up one morning, I worked second shift. I woke up one morning, had just moved to a new apartment. I had a little 13-inch black and white TV, hooked up the rabbit ears to it, tried to get a local TV station, and I watched the terrorist attacks unfold on the World Trade Center. And so that, the attacks on 9/11 spurred me to call the Army recruiter. And I remember that conversation. I called him and I said, you don't, thinking, because recruiters are supposed to be really aggressive about getting people to join the military. And I was like, well, we're at a time of war. I'm 18 years old. They're probably eager to get me. And I remember calling and saying, you don't have to convince me. I want to join. And you do this dream sheet when you go to basic training. And it's basically, what stateside bases would you like to go to, or cities or states? And then likewise, what overseas ones? And for my stateside, I can't remember where I put. Overseas, I believe I put Alaska, South Korea, and maybe Hawaii. I wanted to go to the Pacific if they sent me there. And at the time, we were only in Afghanistan. We hadn't been to Iraq yet. And I thought I would go to whatever unit stateside to be sent to Afghanistan. That was my anticipation. But after I completed AIT, which is Advanced Individual Training, for my job skill, I was there for, I did 9 weeks of basic training, and then 6 months of my skills training. And then I got my orders for the 2nd Infantry Division up by the DMZ in South Korea. And so I was a little angry because people were going to Afghanistan and I was going to the DMZ, but I went there for my first duty assignment. And right around that time, the war in Iraq started, and I started having these internal conflicts about that. Being in South Korea, am I hiding out from being where everybody else is going, where they need me? And so I remember calling basically the human resources for the Army for my job skill. And I had canceled my orders. I only needed one more signature to stay in South Korea and get bonus pay and all that stuff. I called the branch, U.S. Army branch, and I spoke to a woman who was very kind, very nice, and I asked her to give me orders to the first unit that was deploying, the next unit that was deploying. And she must have asked me, I still can hear her voice in my head, she must have asked me several times, "Are you sure, honey? Are you sure that's what you want?" And I was like, "Yes, please do." And then so she sent me to 2nd Brigade, 10th Mountain out of Fort Drum, New York. Before you go up into Iraq, again, we had only been in Iraq about a year at the time, the U.S. had. And so things were still relatively fresh there, but you fly into Kuwait, and then all the vehicles you put on a ship a month before are finally arriving at the ports. And then you got to get your vehicles off. And then you're basically spending a few weeks or up to a month in Kuwait getting ready to go north. And that was a really interesting, preparing to go north of the border was interesting, because I was around like 9 years old when the first Gulf War happened. I remember seeing pictures in the paper of reservists who were being deployed. I remember seeing videos of the bombings, and I remember meeting some in my class in elementary school. I remember there being some Iraqi refugees in class, and so I remember hearing their stories. And so it was more than a little. There was a lot of anxiety and pressure and unknowns about, we heard about weapons of mass destruction, we heard about all sorts of things. So you're in the desert, sand dunes, first time I'd ever been in any desert, really hot, right in the middle of summer, and preparing to go north. And I had, because of who I was, I like to volunteer for things a lot, obviously at this point. And so I had volunteered to be the driver of this large cargo vehicle. And I was the only one that was licensed to drive it. In the military, you have to have a license like anything else. Every piece of equipment, license. That first drive into Iraq really taught me, it because of everything that the unknowns, it really shaped the rest of my understanding of the country. And every time we stopped at a camp to refuel and whatnot, because I drove the biggest vehicle, that also meant I had to tow all the other vehicles that were broken down. Sometimes I had to tow them while we were on the road. Sometimes I had to tow them while at the camp to the mechanics, and then I had to stay there while they worked on it. And so, and this happened every stop. Every time we stopped somewhere, I couldn't get any sleep because I had to move the vehicle. And then it was just so hot, even at night. It was just so hot, and we tried to sleep on top of the vehicle to kind of cool off. But then people would wake us up because they're like, you can't sleep on top of the vehicle, it's dangerous, right? So, but it was nice and cool up there. But it was just, you got no sleep that first night. But the second night, I was like, okay, we're fine, I'll catch up. We had, the great thing about the cab of this truck is we had giant boxes in the back that normally had gear, but we stored a bunch of snacks and food. So we were good as far as all that goes. But my vehicle was the slowest in the convoy. I had Mark 19 grenade launchers, I had 50 caliber rifles and huge crates, really heavy. Most of the heaviest equipment that we had for our unit was in the back of the truck. And that first leg of the journey, I saw that, when they say balls to the wall, the lever all the way forward, there was a throttle and it says don't do this, but I did because you're going forever. So I found that I could go at most 44 to 45 miles per hour. And so when we got to that first stop, I told the commander and everybody else you have these briefings at every leg of the journey. And they said the second leg was supposed to be the most dangerous. There was more people, there was more, threats of attacks. There had been recently. And I had asked them, I asked the commander, which, I was a young soldier at the time, but, I asked her, how fast do we move as a convoy? And then people would pipe up, we're as fast as our slowest moving vehicle. And I said, well, that's me. I can only go 44 or 45 miles per hour. And then so they said, well, we're only going to go that fast. Well, we get to this area, and I had like this little intercom radio. We don't even have like a real radio system. And the helicopter close air support comes in, and wouldn't you know, everybody else gets nervous and they step on the gas. And me and Private Sanchez are in the biggest vehicle at the very end, and we get so far behind, I can't even see the convoy. We're just by ourselves. And he's nervous, and I'm nervous, and he's making me more nervous, and I'm already nervous as it was, and we can't reach anybody over the radio. I'm like, they have to see us. And, but then we get to this area where there's more people, I guess, some villages. And probably something that would stick in my memory for the rest of my life was, we were told beforehand, when we get to this area, don't throw your MREs, your meals ready to eat. Don't throw bottles of water they're gonna ask you for food and water. Don't do it. And they told us the reason why is because you give them some, they're gonna want more, right? Which is like, why would you deprive people of food and water? But that's what they told us. Well, we get to this area where there's some villages, and I start cursing. I get real upset because I noticed that the trucks in front of me had been throwing food and water bottles to mostly children, but a lot of villagers on the side. And that made me mad because I was like, I'm the last vehicle. I'm the biggest vehicle. They're gonna think I'm loaded with food and water, which, except for some Slim Jims and Gatorades, I didn't. It was all equipment. And they start speeding past. They start speeding down the road. And the children, all different ages, started like walking out into this road ahead of me because they saw me coming. And it got to the point where I kept driving further to the left of the road. But then some kids were coming to the right, and I can't even tell you how many kids. There's several dozen kids that were coming into the road. And I remember, she must have been a teenager, but I remember this girl and a bunch of other kids, and they just stood right in the middle of the road, like I'm driving 40, throttle 40 some miles an hour, and they just put their hands up, trying to stop my vehicle. And, I'm nervous because we have weapons in the back, and we have things that they go missing, I'm in a lot of trouble for. I wasn't so much worried about our safety with the children. I was worried about Private Sanchez, who was really nervous, and he had the gun. I was really worried about what he would do with his rifle. And I was also worried that I would hit these kids. So I kept going 40-some miles an hour, and I had veered off to the left lane, and there was a long convoy of empty fuel trucks coming in the opposite direction, coming that way. And at the very front is a dump truck, right? And this dump truck has a .50 caliber rifle on the back, and there's a gunner, and that's their protection, right, for all these trucks. They're not going anywhere. They're all going the same direction. This dump truck is bigger than I am. It's not moving. And I remember the driver and the gunner just like telling me to move over. So it was, for me, it was either stop, get overrun by the villagers, to keep going, hit these young kids. I still remember the faces, particularly the young girl, or risk the head-on collision with this dump truck that's going faster than I am. And last minute, I'm able to swerve around the kids and barely miss the oncoming dump truck. And they were just, I could see their eyes, right? They were just trying to sway me over. But we get to the next leg of the journey, and the next stop, and everybody seems cool. They seem, fine. They made it this way. But we do you also do like this after action review, after you went through. And I was only an E4 at the time, especially. I might have been an E3 at the time, private first class. One of the two, I can't remember. But I remember swearing and cussing at the lieutenant and in front of a bunch of people. But nothing happened to me in that regard. But so that second day was probably the hardest, coming up there. But that really shaped, I perceived like the war zone. I perceived what Iraq would be. But that was really my first introduction into it's somebody's home, somebody's country. People were living there. They're trying to get by. So that really shaped the rest of my deployment and my rest of my experience there for the rest of my life. So.
9/11 was a huge factor for me. I remember being in high school, watching the towers, and that immense sense of patriotism of this was an attack on us, and I want to do something about it. I was 17 when I joined, so a couple of years had passed from 9/11, and I had talked to several recruiters, and I finally met the recruiter that recruited me into the Army, and he gave me the best option, and said, here's what we can do for you, and I kind of ran with it. I did one tour in Iraq. The deployment was from 2008 to 2009. We were in the Camp Taji area of Iraq, which is a little north of Baghdad. Iraq was towards the end of my first enlistment. Basic training was in 2004, and I was just getting ready to finish my first enlistment. I actually re-enlisted when I was in Iraq for another 3 years on top of my contract. We did everything and anything under the sun. We did a lot of mounted patrols and dismounted patrols, but probably one of my favorite things we did was looking for weapons caches. I myself found 2. My company found, I think, 5 total, and that was the most out of anybody in our brigade. Essentially, a weapons cache is any site where they have buried or hidden weapons that can be used at a later date. So what we found a lot was a lot of artillery rounds that were buried in the ground. The largest weapons cache that my company found was a barn that had plastic wells actually buried in the ground. And it was full of RPGs, mortar rounds, heavy machine gun ammunition. The walls had anti-aircraft guns in them. You name it, it was probably in there. EOD, the explosive ordnance detection guys, come in and they will blow them in place a lot of times. And that's what happened. I actually found one weapons cache before they found the big one. It was 46 rounds of artillery rounds, ranging from a 105, which is a rather small artillery round, to a 155, which is the most common. They came in and blew that in place. And then later that night, they got called out again for that large one that was at the barn. For me, this was a really great day. The weapons cache I found, I was walking around with the metal detector, and I had half my team on one side of this, trying to think of the word I want to use to call it, not a ditch, but a smaller stream, I guess. He was on one side using the metal detector with a couple other guys, and I was on the other side, and he was picking up trash can or garbage, really. And then I found this spot that was 25 to 30 feet long, and my team leader looked at me and said, "Carl, you got something for me?" I said, "I think so." He goes, "Well, what do you mean by you think so?" So I marked a spot in the ground and said, "Well, it starts here." And I walked back to him and I said, "It ends here." And he looked at me, he goes, "Well, I think you got something then." So we called for shovels and we start digging, and I start getting into the ground farther and farther, and then I hear my first tink. At that point, my stomach sinks and my heart goes in my throat, because I'm thinking to myself, did I just hit the tip of a round and I'm gonna blow up? Luckily I didn't. I uncovered it and I had hit the body of it, and as I was uncovering it, it still had the fuse cap on it. So these were rounds that were still quite viable to be sent downrange, as we say. And as we're uncovering it, the hole gets bigger and bigger and bigger as these are stacked 3 and 4 rounds deep. And we're just having the best time getting these out of the ground and getting them stacked up. And we called EOD, and they had actually been on another site with our 3rd platoon that same day, and we called up to them, told them we had a very dangerous round on ground. 2 of the smaller rounds that we had found were actually white phosphorus rounds, something that hadn't been used since Vietnam. So that was really scary, and when we told them we had that on ground, they said, "Okay, we need to blow this weapons cache that we have here in place, and we'll be there in 5 minutes." From where we were at, we could see the explosion that they called us from, or we called them from, really. And they were on our site within 5 minutes. They had laid out a spot in the ground where they could safely detonate them and put the explosives on top of it. And we pull the vehicles away from that spot, and then EOD does their thing and calls for detonation, and then you hear fire in the hole, fire in the hole, fire in the hole come over the radio, and big boom. We actually did set up cameras so we could capture it, and the camera takes some of the shockwave and you can see it rattle a little bit, but we're far enough away from the shockwave that it doesn't do any damage to anybody or the vehicles. Not all days were like that. I mean, we had our rough days, but I look back on those 12 years and I made lifetime friends that I really miss. It's because of the Vietnam vets we got the welcome home we did. You know, we got an escort in, and we were welcomed with open arms from everyone. And you know, I can't say enough about the welcoming that we got compared to what the Vietnam veterans got. And the Vietnam veterans were the ones standing front and center saying, "Welcome home."
I commissioned largely because of college. I got the opportunity to attend the Naval Academy, and I kind of couldn't pass that up. As you know, it's a paid-for school and it's difficult, but it was a great opportunity. So did 4 years at the Naval Academy and then commissioned into the Navy afterwards, where I went off to my first ship. So for us, we kind of do our Naval Academy version of a boot camp just before your freshman year. So after that, depending on what you go do, if you're a pilot, you'll go off to flight school. For me, I was a surface warfare officer, so I got 30 days of leave after school, and then after that, I was on my first ship trying to figure out which way was up and which way was down as a brand new ensign in the Navy. So my first ship was the Tarawa, so it was the USS Tarawa. It was the LHA-1, and it was actually the Tarawa class. And so if you think of an aircraft carrier, it's basically kind of one step down from an aircraft carrier, and it's one of the ships that the back end opens up, and we work with Marines getting them to shore and helping them deploy. On my first deployment in 2005, from 2005 to 2006, it was about 9 months, we were on our way over to the Arabian Gulf, and on the way there, I don't remember the exact month, it must have been October, November of 2005, there was a large earthquake in Pakistan, and a lot of the houses outside of the cities there are built into the hillsides, into the mountainsides. And so when that earthquake happened, it was just disastrous for a large part of the region. And they asked for humanitarian, help and relief and all that stuff. And so my ship, being the largest ship in our strike group, the admiral that was running the group of ships that I was with, he was put in charge of the disaster relief. And so a core element of his staff went out to lead the disaster relief in country in Pakistan. And as an ensign, there was a fair amount of us. I had fully qualified, and I volunteered to go with that disaster resistance relief. And I got the opportunity to spend the second half of my deployment, about 4 months total, in Pakistan doing that. A lot of the rescue had been done by the Pakistani, military and government before we had a chance to get out there. Really, what our relief efforts did was we set up hospital units, right? So we worked with not only Navy but Air Force, Army, Marine Corps. So if you think of our Army MASH units, right, the show MASH, we helped lead the effort in setting up one of those MASH units out there. Marine Corps hospital units that were more remote, as well as providing shelter, food, all sorts of things. My major in college didn't really have much to do with what I was learning on the ground in Pakistan. I was actually a political science major, so some of that played in, right, the international relations and things like that. But really, you're just kind of learning as you go. Specifically at the Naval Academy, everybody's required to take certain engineering courses. So I did have a baseline technical foundation for working on the ship and things like that. But largely, when you're out there, there's not too much of your degree that's necessarily being put towards that. Sometimes it is, if it's more technical. Because I was so junior, I was given the menial tasks. I wasn't in charge of a lot of the big projects. That was for folks who had a lot more experience than I did. I had been in the Navy all of a year and a half at that point. But I got the opportunity to do some contractor work, getting toys for the kids in the disaster regions. So I actually worked with a local contractor on finding different things like little toy helicopters that looked just like the Army helicopters that were flying around providing relief. And we would have stickers with the Pakistani and American flag on them, or knit caps, or soccer balls, or cricket sets, because cricket's big over there. So I got to work with a local contractor ordering those, And then I actually got the opportunity to fly around a little bit and help distribute some of those toys and stuff like that to the kids in the regions. The regions where we were at, they tended to be a little bit more, on the not as affluent side, largely because, again, most of them were further away from the city. However, there was a fair amount that was pretty close to the city as well. But yeah, I got some positive feedback from some of the units that were stationed out there that were actually living closer to the disaster areas, because I personally was part of the headquarters element. And so I was living more in the city, working out of the embassy a little bit later. But we got some good feedback that the kids enjoyed, getting those, and it's just kind of an easy thing to cheer someone up. It gives you perspective. That's really what it does more than anything else, is when, as a commanding officer now, right, and it's largely reserve sailors and some active duty sailors, I have that experience, that perspective of, hey guys, this is the big picture. And that big picture perspective goes a long way when you have to buckle down and do things like COVID support, like we've been doing for the past year and change, of mobilizing reservists to help out with COVID missions around the country. And having that big picture perspective and the opportunities to deploy to regions like that, it goes a long ways in being able to kind of translate what sometimes people get locked in on is just here, but if you look at the bigger picture, I think that's where it plays. Well, part of the disaster relief, when we were in country, I think it was the first time that American military had been on the ground in Pakistan in something like 20 or 30 years. I don't know exactly, but we actually had, for that particular disaster, an outpouring around the world of support. So Japan sent forces over to help. Really, it was just delivery of goods and helping in, like I said, hospitals and stuff. So the Japanese, the Germans, Australians, they had folks that were working with us, whether, anywhere from folks who were helping with flight operations in our helicopters to the logistics sides of things, to potentially doing some rescue stuff for folks in the much more remote regions. So I got to do that a little bit. It was a pretty cool experience. I spent Thanksgiving sitting next to people from all over the world. It was interesting. Right now, I'm the commanding officer of the Reserve Center here in Erie. It's a Navy Operational Support Center, Erie, so here it's called NOSC, Erie. I am the commanding officer, and so I basically run the staff element, and we provide support and help keep reservists who do their 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year, and then occasionally they mobilize as well. We help kind of keep them trained and ready. So we provide support to them so that they can do short notice missions, like the hospital ship that went up to New York when COVID first hit. We sent sailors up there. So we had sailors leave here and go up there for a couple months to help out with that effort. We've sent sailors, to other parts of the country to help with COVID relief operations, as well as sailors around the world. So that's part of what Navy Reserve Centers do. So my route was different, largely because I didn't know. So I am one of the unique folks. I'd say my path is not typical. I applied actually to the Naval Academy very late, whereas most people who apply to the Naval Academy are thinking about it their junior year of high school, and that's when they start their application. I started very late. But as far as, I did work in recruiting. So I've had the opportunity to talk to young men and women, whether it's enlisted or officer, that they're interested in, and kind of help guide them and answer their questions and see if the Navy is the right fit for them.
I joined, I was living in a small town in Cambridge Springs, and I had 3 children at the time, well, still do, but I wanted to do more, and I wanted them to see that they could do more too, and it doesn't matter what stage in your life you are, follow your dreams. My dad is who I guess identify with the most and who I talk to the most. My dad was in Vietnam, and we used to have family picnics on the beach with old Army rations. That was kind of our picnic food. So whenever I was, I guess, questioning something or had questions or wanted more information, my dad is the first person I called. My grandfather also served. I have several cousins in different branches of the military, but I always called my dad. I still call my dad, and we now trade stories a little bit. And one of the funny things that my dad says, he goes, you know, Angie, out of all of these boys that I've had, it took a girl to follow in my footsteps. It was a very difficult decision. My oldest son, my goodness, at the time, he was 12, my daughter was 10, and then my youngest son was 8. So they're all 2 years apart. And I had never been away from them, not especially for any length of time. I picked, actually my number one, it's the one I got, which was Fort Lewis, Washington, out near Seattle and Tacoma. So I joined because I wanted my kids to see the world and not know what happens and where places were just by a book. I wanted to literally show them the world. And so we moved to the West Coast. So when I joined in July of 2001. And when I got to what they call reception, which is where they kind of do all of your in-processing, there were too many potential soldiers, because you're not quite a soldier yet, you haven't gone through that basic training. There were too many there, so I was held back in reception for, it was a total of 8 weeks. I missed my youngest son's birthday when he turned 5. I missed my daughter's birthday when she turned 8. So I guess to go back on the ages a little bit, I was 2 years ahead. You start to lose time a little bit. And not having that purpose yet, not knowing what training was coming, not knowing what I was going to be trained for, that was a huge mental game, mental toughness that I had to overcome. I was at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. When I went in, I went in originally as an enlisted soldier. So I was a transportation operator, has absolutely nothing to do with signal and communications, but that was my job for the National Guard. And that's where the transportation largely is trained. It's down in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. About 3 days before 9/11, we had a conscientious objector training. So they do a mock play of the United States is being attacked, and what are you going to do? And it's for that really hard gut check of, do you have what it takes to be in the military? And 3 days later, I was on KP, which is kitchen patrol, so kitchen duty. And I just remember the way that our drill sergeants came in. We're like, oh man, what did somebody do now? You know, we're in for it. And they said, stop immediately everything that you're doing and get back to the barracks as soon as possible. And we just knew that there was something a little bit different, but there was that little part of us that were like, okay, this is just another little thing. They're going to mess with us a little bit. And by the time that I think there was probably a group of like 8 to 10 of us. And by the time we made it to the classroom, again, you just knew there was something completely different. There was no joking, there was no talking, and we had no TVs up until that point. I hadn't seen a TV in 2 months. The televisions were going. And I had already been starting to have those feelings of, what did I do? I left my 3 young kids, and seeing all of that happen, it was another huge gut check of, what did I just do? But the reasons why I joined weren't just for my children. It was because I wanted to be a better citizen. I wanted to be a better person. I felt like I had something to give. And that feeling never left. I never wavered. So we went out, we called our families, made sure everybody was safe. And the next day, you can bet that our training was completely different. There was that sense of purpose and that sense of importance, that we weren't just out there to play in the mud or to play on some ropes or, on a huge, army playground, I guess. But the purpose and importance was completely different. The feel of the training was different. It was a lot more intense. The job that I was ultimately assigned was a signal communications officer. So I help people talk. So it can be computers, it can be radios, satellites, and any form of communication. it was up to me and the team and the soldiers that I worked with to help other people communicate. I was in FOB Diamondback, so Forward Operating Base Diamondback, which is in Mosul. I ran what was called a node center. So essentially it's like a telephone company, and you have different subscribers and clients off of this main node center, and it would go off to another like little out site, and then they would go to another out site from there. Communications again. We had a lot of striker brigades that were operating around that time right through there, so helping them have communications when they're out doing a movement was pretty key. We also set up the computer networks and the telephone networks up there. The things I remember was the sound of birds. And I know it might sound a little crazy, but there were so many pigeons. The trees were literally alive with these pigeons. And the sound of them it was almost deafening. And having to walk in the temperature, the highest temperature I've seen was 126. You'd walk a few feet, then you'd have to stop. And then you'd have to walk a few feet, then you would have to stop. It just completely took the energy right out of you. So there was that. So we called it shadow hopping. That's what the soldiers and I called it. So there was the shadow hopping between that to escape the heat a little bit. And I learned quickly, because I had to run shifts 24/7. I started taking later shifts because it was a little bit cooler at night, but not always. So there was that. There was a young Iraqi man, and he used to stand around the outside of our motor pool, which is where we store all of our equipment and our vehicles. And my soldiers on downtime, they would either play ping pong or football. And they would be out there throwing the football across this parking lot. And one day I just watched, because I didn't always, join in, just let them have their own time away from, the boss lady, I guess. But they invited him to play. And to see that connection, there was no language communication. There was this huge barrier. But it was just through just that common human, I guess, decency. They taught him how to throw a football. And it's just those little things like that that really caught my attention when I was there. Just that human decency and exchange. Later on I felt like I had made a big impact, or at least some impact on some people, and through my service. And there's one term that we use in the military, and that's selfless service. Once that's instilled in you, one of those core values is instilled in you, you don't let go of it. So I am very committed to helping other people, and that's something that I haven't stopped and I enjoy doing. And I give that credit to the military. It helped me step up and instill a lot of values, or even just give a term to the values that I had. And the selfless service is one, like I said, I still do. I'm on the board for the Behavioral Health Council here in Erie at the VA. And it is a way to still help other soldiers and other veterans that are coming back that need that extra help.
So at a young age, my parents had taken me to see the Thunderbirds. I went to an air show in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and saw the Thunderbirds. And at that young age, it must have been about 10, I knew that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to fly. And however I was gonna get there, that was my dream. So it was always Thunderbirds. And I had that clear vision all through high school. Everyone who knew me knew that I was going to be a pilot and I was going to fly. So when I went for a scholarship to go to school, I went to the Air Force first. And the Air Force informed me, if you take the ROTC scholarship, we will tell you what your major is going to be, and you cannot change that major. And we actually get most of our pilots from the Air Force Academy. And at the time, I wasn't ready to go far from home. I was from Pittsburgh, and the Air Force Academy is in Colorado, and I wasn't willing to do that. I really wanted to go to Penn State. So the Navy was one floor up, and I walked upstairs to the Navy and never thought about the Navy. I asked them about a scholarship, and they said, you can major in whatever you want, and we get most of our pilots from ROTC. And I said, sign me up. So my transition from Thunderbirds to Blue Angels. I was like, I'll be the first female Blue Angel. That's easy enough. And that was my focus in high school, and now in college, I was gonna be a Blue Angel. Well, between your junior and senior year of college, they send you to an aircraft carrier. So as your midshipman, they send you to your midshipman cruise to see all the platforms that the Navy offers and see what you might be interested in doing. Now, I was very set on jets, but when I got attached to the USS Eisenhower in the Mediterranean, so I took a flight from Pittsburgh to Cannes, France, and met the USS Eisenhower, I was attached to the helicopter squadron. And I didn't even know the Navy had helicopters. I thought it was an Army platform. So I was like, okay, helicopters, great. It seems like a very boring job, something I'm not interested in all, but they had an F-14 squadron on the carrier. But the F-14 squadron wasn't taking any midshipmen, and they wouldn't let any midshipmen fly. But that was my dream. So I walked into that ready room, the Jolly Rogers, and this is a time when it was all men, and I sat down in a chair in the ready room, and the CO was like, what are you doing here? And I said, I want to fly. And he goes, we're not getting any hops to midshipmen, and hops what they call a flight. We're not getting any hops to midshipmen, and you need to get out of here. And I said, no, this is my dream, and I want to fly. And he goes, what school do you go to? And I said, Penn State. And he goes, Big Ten, you're flying. And it's because he went to Indiana. So it was so great because I was on this midshipman cruise with other midshipmen from Harvard and Princeton, and they were giving me a hard time for going to a state school, but I was the only midshipman who got to fly in an F-14. So I sat in the back seat, like Goose and Top Gun. We got the cat shot off the carrier. We flew for 2 hours. We broke the sound barrier. We did barrel rolls. We were pulling G's. The CO flew at the same time in his jet, and he played the Indiana fight song over the radio, so I had to listen to it. But it was amazing. And then we caught the trap on the way in, and that was it. I was sold. I was gonna fly jets. 3 days later, I'm in a helicopter. So if you're a midshipman attached to a squadron, you can fly whenever you'd like. So every day I would come in and go, I'll take that flight. A helicopter on an aircraft carrier has a pretty basic job. They fly what they call starboard D. So you're flying on the starboard side of the ship in a basic D formation, and you're basically waiting for an aircraft to get in some kind of distress. You're there to rescue somebody if something happens. So that's your whole job. And all of a sudden I'm sitting there with 2 rescue swimmers. I'm sitting in the back of the helicopter, and we hear aircraft in the water. And we just look at each other, and 2 F-14s that hit each other. So it's something we don't really practice today because there aren't many militaries that we're not allies with who have the capability in military aircraft like we do. So they were practicing dogfighting, and they weren't very good at it, and they clipped wings. And one of the jets actually happened to be the pilot I had flown with. He made it back to the carrier, and another one had went into the water in the Mediterranean. So we go flying over. Again, I'm a midshipman in college. I have no training. I have no idea what's happening. I'm sitting in the back of this helicopter, and they rescue the NFO, so the naval flight officer who sits in back, and he had broken his leg 90 degrees the opposite direction. And it's hanging on, and they get him into the helicopter, and unfortunately the pilot had been killed. He had hit his head on the canopy and got wrapped up in his parachute. The rescue swimmer went down and cut him out of his parachute. And when we got back to the carrier, they were gonna life flight the NFO over to Turkey to save his leg. But I helped carry the stretcher because I was there and I was in a flight suit and I wanted to be of help. And he looks up at me and he says, when I heard the rotors coming, I knew I was gonna be okay. And when he said that to me, I changed in that moment, and I decided to be a helicopter pilot. So it was just those words were enough for me to change my whole dream to this is what I want to do. I want to fly helicopters. Usually your jet guys, they're not there to help, they're there to hurt. But the helicopters, they're there to help. So that day I decided I'm going to be a helicopter pilot. And I went to flight school. I graduated first in my class. I got my wings 3 days after 9/11. So I got wings September 14th, 2001. And I became a helicopter pilot. I went right out to San Diego. I decided before I left, I got winged in September 14th, and before I was supposed to check in for duty October 1st, I decided to go to ground zero. I wanted to see it. And this was the time when there were still lost posters and things like that. And my mom is from New York. My mom is from Jackson Heights, Queens. And so I had family there. And by the time we all logistically made it to ground zero, it was midnight. So it was very quiet and ominous as we walk up, and I'm looking around and I see a New York police officer. And I go over and I talk to him and I said, where can I get a patch? And he's like, those stores are closed right now. And I said, I know, but I would really love to have a New York PD patch. I told him, I'm a Navy pilot. I just got my wings. We're going to San Diego. We don't know what's gonna happen. And I would love to fly with a patch. Because as a pilot, you have to wear the flag on this side, but you can wear whatever you would like on this side of your flight suit. And he looked at me and he goes, you're a pilot? And I said, yes, and he ripped it off his coat. I still have it. So this is what I flew with. I did 2 deployments to the Middle East, and this is the patch I wore. And I still have it. So this came directly off his coat, and I was proud to fly with it.
That's beautiful.
And my American dream is really straightforward. It's that we grow to appreciate the nation that we live in, that we understand that there were people that came before us who had this idea of what a nation could be. And that really has struck and resonated with me. What can America be? What can we do? What can we provide for ourselves, and not just for ourselves, but for our families? And that we can be so unrestricted in who we can become and what we can do. It's amazing to me, having been in different parts of the world where your life is kind of set out for you. Here's what you can do, here's who you can become because of who your family is or what your family's done in the past. That's not us. Our story is of freedom and liberty and all of those things that give the individual the opportunity to say, hey, if you have an idea in your mind and you want to proceed with that and you want to go forward with that, it's open, it's available. And we see that on so many different levels. I think what we tend to do is focus at times on the negative too much, and we don't recognize those opportunities that the American experience provides for us. It's kind of a corny analogy, but I'll use the analogy from Epcot Center at Walt Disney World, the American adventure. You go in and you watch this animated story of America, and it strikes me the opportunity that's there, that for those characters that play some portion of that, they're people just like we are. For the most part, they're not, born into any great position, but they may assume a great position, or they may have a great idea that allows them to pursue that American experience. And that, to me, is the great motivation in life for us as Americans, is we can do that stuff. As you tie that into people who've served in the military, those are the people who've given us the opportunity. Those are the people who've given us blood, sweat, tears, and even their lives, so that we can go out and we can have this experience that's truly American, that we can do the things that we want to do. There's always the possibility that we could fail, but there's not the possibility we can't try. And the possibility that we can try, that we can go out and do those things that so many other people never get to do, that we have the freedoms to do that. It's really wonderful. So for me, as I spent 30 years in the military, having a family of my own kids, I translate that to them. Your dad, for his service, gave you, my kids, and my grandkids, and generations to come, the opportunity to go out and seek those things that you want to do. And that's the American experience to me, is that we have that freedom, we have that liberty to go out and be the people who we want to become.